I want to introduce some of the panelists here tonight with us, and I think you'll agree that this is a pretty august group. Colonel Bill Coleman was the Air Force spokesman, bomber pilot, later became the chief spokesman for the Pentagon for the Air Force. He was very instrumental in speaking on matters that had to do with UFOs because he was actually representing that position for the Air Force in Blue Book. Colonel Bob Friend began his career as a Tuskegee Airman, World War II. He ended up then going off to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where he did a lot of test work and maybe by accident or maybe by intent wound up as the project officer for Project Blue Book. Colonel Chuck Hall was a maintenance officer in the Air Force. That's how he started out. Then he became a base commander at RAF Bentwaters, and there was a rather famous incident that you'll probably hear about tonight at Bentwaters. He ended up going on to be the commander of Bentwaters. And then after that wasn't enough. He ended up going off to be the head of the Directorate of Inspections for the Department of Defense Inspector General. Now, if you don't, that term isn't too familiar with you, the Inspector General are the folks that investigate complaints and incidents and happenings within the services that are not something that the normal commander is going to handle at the disciplinary level. It's usually an organizational or unusual problem. And so we'll hear a little bit from Chuck about some of that a little bit later too. John Alexander has served as a Special Forces commander in Vietnam for the Army. After that, he was involved in some of the programs for the Army labs and then worked at Los Alamos National Lab in non-lethal weapons development. And John has written a book, and it's about UFOs, and you'll hear some more about that today too. Mr. Nick Pope worked for the Ministry of Defense in the UK. He was one of the chief investigators and handled the UFO incidents for the UK. And he's also an author of a book, Open Skies, Closed Minds. So with that introduction, I'd like to start the discussion tonight with Bob Friend and Bill Coleman. And Bob, you may wish to start this discussion. The floor is yours, sir.
If anyone was to ask me, is a UFO real? As I already stated, they are certainly real. They're real because they're things that people have experienced. They're real because we've been able to, in many instances, track down exactly what the cause was. But there's a small percent that we have not yet been able to solve. And what I believe and recommended in 2 staff studies is that an agency such as NASA or an advanced projects agency take on the task of doing the analysis, the in-depth analysis of these things, because the Air Force's primary reason for being after the program was to see whether or not these things represented a threat to our national security. Once that was done, it started to take a second seat. It wasn't as important that they knew exactly what it was. However, it does prove somewhere along the line that they do need that kind of information. Why? And the reason is that our defense forces, when they're looking at information that comes onto their various detection devices, are looking for signature data. If it's something that they know they've seen before, they don't commit our defense forces. Because when you commit a defense force, that's when you're most vulnerable. So my primary explanation for these things is that yes, they're real. And I would think that it would be much better if the government or some other agency was to take on these things and to pursue the scientific aspects of it, because they could very easily be so important to us scientifically from the fact that they herald the possible onslaught of some of nature's worst things for us, hurricanes and tsunamis and what have you. Maybe this is what happens. For instance, ball lightning. We've had a number of sightings that were ball lightnings. These are little magnetic lights that seem to float. They don't seem to obey any of the laws of nature, but electrically. And in making some of these investigations, we have seen evidence that they did exist. You saw it in the picture, sightings of the third kind, close encounters of the third kind. And in close encounters of the third kind, they showed you that these things were reported from a sighting in Levelland, Texas. And the movie took them and tried to roll several of the sightings all into one. And they showed this ship car being unable to run its electrical system because it had been shut down by the presence of these items. Now, we haven't been able to duplicate ball lightning in the lab, to my knowledge. So, consequently, it is something that does indeed need whatever the constituents are from nature to be in evidence. So, I would just say, thanks to everyone here that UFO sightings are real, and you will not be ridiculed by any honest organization that investigates it. Just come forward, report your case, and allow the people to do the best they can to make some determination of what it is that you've seen. But real sightings. I know that people, in discussing the cases of various individuals, that it sounds rather unique, for a person to say, I came to a sighting that I think is result of UFO landing in my backyard and offering me pancakes as a substitute for water or as a trade for water. That man had a real experience. And I knew he had a real experience. And it wasn't for me to try to convince him otherwise. The government psychologist said, if you ever convince him that what he had was some sort of mental hallucination, then he'll have a real problem. So it's much better that what we do is put it aside and allow him to go on with the way in which he's doing it. The little town in Wisconsin made a lot of money off of those space cakes. But because when we got those space cakes from him and sent them to the laboratory, they actually were identified with a specific maker here in the United States. So we understood exactly what had happened. He was snowed in and he hallucinated, thought it was real, treated it as real, and so we treated it as real. So in the future, just remember that we're on your side. Thank you.
So somebody else who worked in Project Blue Book from a little different angle was Colonel Bill Coleman. Bill.
I'm going to take out my ad libs in case I need to refer to them. It's an honor for me to come and speak here, and I'm glad for the opportunity, Alan, of bringing Bob Friend and others I've known before in one way or another through this business. First, I'm going to take you a ride in a Mitchell bomber. In 1955, I had to take a Mitchell bomber from Greenville, Mississippi to the Miami International Airport. The airplane was going in for a complete overhaul, complete engine change, complete rebuild, and I would pick up one that had just been completely overhauled and fly back to Greenville. I took with me a young officer, West Pointer, as my co-pilot. I picked the best flight engineer on a Mitchell bomber that I've ever run into as my flight engineer. Since I was responsible for 120 jet aircraft, I brought along the Lockheed representative with us from the Lockheed Company, and I also brought along the Allison Jet Engine Division guy from General Motors Corporation, because I wanted to talk business. My concern was keeping 120 jets flying, at least 85% in commission and in good shape. Now, to move on with the B-25, on our way to Miami, it was just a normal flight. I went in, landed International, moved over to the overhaul depot, and we spent the night there. And the next morning, I planned to pick up the new B-25, which I did. And we loaded up, and I flew. I'm going to give you details of the flight. I flew direct from Miami to Fort Myers. I turned on airways at Fort Myers and flew up to Tallahassee, over to Marianna, Florida, and then I flew direct to Meridian, Mississippi, where I would start my down into Greenville. And after we passed Marianna, I pumped up my co-pilot, said, take over, I'm going to talk to these two guys. And in the B-25, your seat, the pilot seat slides back. They were in the navigator's compartment, so I called them up so we could start talking about our mutual business of keeping these airplanes in commission. And after we'd been talking about 5 or 10 minutes, the co-pilot punched me and said, take a look at 2 o'clock high. So I pulled my seat back up, and I said, well, it looks like a craze on the windshield. You know what a craze is, like a scratch, and we're reflecting sunlight, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, no clouds, but clear skies, visibility great, 10 or 12 miles easy. And so I said, well, I'll find out. Let me give me the control. So I took and started a turn. And I said, if it's a craze, it'll disappear. If it's an object, it'll slide across the canopy as I turn. And it did. But then it started a very fast, sudden descent. All we saw literally was a bright silver object. And we started catching up on it. I'm at about 8,500 feet. So finally it hit 8,500 feet, and I'm starting down with it. And so we watched it, went down to the ground. I got close enough now. I said, that does not have a tail, and it does not have wings. Okay, guys, don't discuss it. Pay close attention. I want your personal opinion, what you're looking at. We got down on the deck. I'm moving at maximum continuous power on the B-25. I was enjoying about 300 miles an hour on the speed meter. And we got right down on the treetops, and I'm closing in on it very rapidly. And I said, look on the ground. And there was this round circle. I said, I'm going to overtake it. Hang on there. Put your seatbelts on and hang on. And I made a hard wingtip, a 90-degree bank this way, and I pulled up alongside of it. I thought, now we were out of sight of it for that time. And then turned back around, it was not there. I zoomed up to about 1,800 feet. I looked over in a large square mile area that for agriculture had just been, the ground had been broken. It was very dusty. And we could see the object right on the deck, moving at pretty good speed, and had 2 vortexes, which would be normal going across there. So I said, I'm going to dive behind the trees, and I'm going to head him off at the pass. So I got out of sight, and I went down as far as I could go and turn up. And I should have cut him off. There were the 2 big dust trails, but no vehicle. We looked around, I zoomed up, we turned, we looked everywhere. I put my engineer up in the bombardier's compartment for a different view, and he couldn't see anything. I said, okay, guys, we want your opinion. I'll tell you about that later, but no discussion between each other. I don't want you to cook up something that you might. I want your experience. I'll tell you what we're going to do, what we had to do according to the regulation. So we proceeded on to, and I climbed up to back to 8,500 feet, crossed Meridian. I go on down to Greenwood, Mississippi, where I start my penetration into the Greenville airport. And as we descended, I looked up at 1 o'clock high, going like a bat out of you-know-where was our little silver object at about 35 or 40,000 feet. And it just went on out of sight. What did we see? We don't know. But it was real. There was no question about that. I asked each of them to write a report, have it on my desk tomorrow morning without discussing it, have a report on it. And I went down to intelligence, which we were required to do under the regulation, and gave them my statement written as well as theirs. And he then notified whoever they have to notify. Bob, I assume that they notified the Foreign Technology Division, 1955. So I went on, and next thing I know, I'm in the public information at the Pentagon after a tour in the Philippines and a tour in Systems Command working for General Schriever on advanced systems. And also I was involved in the YF-12 and the SR-71 and U-2 programs. And then I was assigned to the Office of Secretary of the Air Force, but General Schriever kept me over there at Systems Command as a special assistant to him on the Dinosaur program and Titan and one other big program, not too important. So anyway, then after 5 months of that, I got all the plans made, and then I went over to the Pentagon to work for the Secretary of the Air Force in the Public Information Division. And suddenly my general, LaValle, called me over and said, Bill, we're going to put you in charge of Project Blue Book, replacing Larry Tackler, who has written a book, as I'm sure some of you read it. Larry and I had different viewpoints on the subject. I said, well, I made the timeout sign. I said, you better listen to my story. I told him the story about the B-25 sighting and the chase and all of that. He said, well, we got to go with the Secretary of the Air Force. You tell him. So we stood in there and I told the Secretary. He said, have a seat. So we told him, and he says, you're just the guy we want for the job. You were objective in your views, and you were very calm and collected about it. You did the right thing. You're just the guy to be the chief spokesman for Project Blue Book. I was kind of hoping he would, say, well, we'll get somebody else, but he didn't. So then I started a relationship with Bob, his boss, Foreign Technology Division with NORAD, and the Air Defense Command. And I enjoyed it very much. I had to answer all the mail written to the President of the United States, the Congress of the United States, and anybody else that wrote the government on the subject. I often wrote letters to be signed by John F. Kennedy himself, and he always did. And I advised the White House associates to make sure if he wants to question me or you want to question me about this, let's have it. But we have an old saying in the Air Force, and we live by it, and it really works. We shall not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate among us any who do. It's a great code to live by. Now, what are some of the dangers that we face should an alien land on this planet? Well, it's happened before in our history, and you can go back and review it. I'm going to give you one, and I call it the Magellan Enigma. When Magellan landed in the Philippines, he introduced tuberculosis to this Malaysian-based population. Today, tuberculosis is the biggest killer in the Philippines. Well, heart trouble, cancer, put them all together, TB, takes them out of the picture. These people had never been exposed to it before. And consequently, it takes quite a few generations for a population to build any kind of immunity to diseases. Now, there are others that you can read about in our history where they've landed and populations have been, so even races of people have been decimated by foreign planet. And that's my point here. If an alien were to land here, our common cold could kill him. His common cold could wipe out the population of planet Earth. If they're smart enough to build a vehicle that can travel light years of time, and I'll go into that in a minute, then he's smart enough to know that his diseases or our diseases could wipe out people. Now, we got a lot of mail, and I got to tell you something. We got a lot of smart, good, thought-out letters. We got a lot of kooky letters. And I remember so well this case that Bob talked about, because we sent a sample of the bread to the General Foods Corporation, and we didn't tell them what we were out for, and there had been no news stories except this guy's coverage by a newspaper. And they wrote down the barley was probably grown somewhere and it was processed by this patented formula. Made in P.S. This appears to be bread. How did he put it, Bob? This appears to be. Well, anyway, what was the phrase they used? You remember? What was the phrase that they used, the company? Oh, an ordinary pancake of earthly origin. That was it. So, they caught us. But we had other places. We don't just take one lab's position. We go to the civilian world. We have our own big materials testing lab at Wright-Patterson, and they are outstanding. They also test it. So we knew what it was. And the big burn circle on the ground was made with Amoco gasoline and a plumber's torch. The people we had working for us are very good at what they do. But like Bob said, had we gone out and blew this guy's story to the American public, we would have put a permanent candidate into a state-owned hospital in Wisconsin. So those are the kind of, we ate a lot of crow. In fact, I've grown quite fond of it. I've had to eat a lot of crow in my lifetime. It's not fun, but you got to be thoughtful about this. I could go on and on. I'm looking through some of my ad-libs here. Well, at my age, and I've almost caught up to Bob. I'll be up with him in about 6 months, but we're in the 90 category, okay? And I think you can begin to tell that. So, and I don't want to really outlive Bob. In fact, I wouldn't mind going with him because we both know we're going to be together wherever it is we're going. And believe me, it's going to be cool there. So I thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions. And one of the most fascinating assignments I had was that. I later got into the SR-71 U-2 programs, and that was a very interesting aspect of my life, as well as the Black Satellite program. Thank you very much.
Bill, thanks very much. Now I'd like to have you hear from Colonel Chuck Holt. Chuck has got one of the more intriguing stories about UFOs in the military I think you'll ever hear. So Chuck, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is going to be difficult because I'm going to try and put about an hour's worth of material in 20 minutes, so forgive me if I speak fast or I leave a few little details out. In the spring of 1980, I was reassigned from the Pentagon to RAF Bentwaters as a deputy base commander. At that time, Bentwaters was the largest tactical fighter wing in the free world. The basic mission of the base was A-10s, was should the fly go up or the balloon go up and the Russians come east, or we would move forward to Germany and kill tanks. Follow-on strike aircraft would come in, pick up pre-positioned weapons, and carry the war to wherever it was needed to be taken. Early in the morning of December 26th, 1980, As typical, I prowled the base a little early in the morning, and I stopped by the police station to pick up the police blotters. The blotters are the chronological listing of the happenings for the previous 24 hours. When I walked into the police station, the desk sergeant, I had a nickname Crash McCabe, started laughing. I said, "What's so funny, Crash?" He said, "Burroughs and Peniston and Cabansag were out in the woods chasing UFOs all night." I said, "What?" You know, we kind of laughed. I said, and he said, "The lieutenant said, don't put anything in the blotter." I said, "Well, what do you know?" He said, "Well, we thought there was a downed aircraft at the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, which was part of the complex." He said they saw lights in the forest. They called Central Security Control, called law enforcement. The air traffic controllers were called. The Eastern Radar, who took care of that air defense sector. Everybody was called. Nothing flying, nothing done, no reports of anything. So they agonized for a while, and all the senior people on board came up to the gate and were looking. So it was decided 3 people would go out in the woods and investigate: Burroughs, Peniston, and Cabansag. They checked their weapons with the senior NCO there, took a pickup truck, and drove down the east gate, into the forest, down a Forest Service road, as close as they could get to this object. And what they came upon was a triangular-shaped object on 3 legs with bright lights, multicolored lights. And what happens from there is rather confusing, because what happened to them? They had a very unusual experience. Peniston initially said that he actually touched this object. It was smooth, metallic, almost like onyx. It had hieroglyphic-like markings on it. It made funny noises. Cabansag, who had been left partly behind as a radio relay because the radios were acting up, remember seeing Burroughs being actually taken aboard the craft. To this day, they're not really sure exactly what happened to them there. They do know that something phenomenal happened. And I didn't know this till many years later, but they were taken in the OSI office, and people, not from the base, actually administered injections of what was probably sodium amytal, or sodium pentothal, as most people know it, and they were hypnotized. Probably partly to debrief, and I'm firmly convinced to plant some false memories. A 4th person was also drugged into it, and I think he was a wannabe. I think he was in the background, but made so much noise and made it sound like he was there that he was involved too. If I'd known this at that time, I think I would have raised some real serious objections, but I didn't find this out till several years later. Well, let's go back to the story. I collected the blotters, I took them up to the office, and we had the staff meeting. The senior officers got together every morning for about 20, 30 minutes, just went over what was going on for the day, what had happened, and so forth. And we all had a chuckle over, yeah, there was a UFO in the woods last night. Didn't think too much more about it. Although I did pick up that all the policemen were just going crazy, almost looking for something and concerned about what happened. 2 nights later, we were having the combat support group. All the officers and families got together for an end of the year sort of party in recognition of what was going on and singling out people for things they had done. It was a covered dish dinner. We just finished the main course, getting ready for dessert, when the flight lieutenant, the on-duty senior police officer, came in white as a sheet, Lieutenant Bruce England. Now, Bruce wasn't just an ordinary lieutenant. Bruce had been in the Marine Corps for 4 years, got out, went back to college, and came into the Air Force. So he was pretty much a seasoned veteran. If something was shaking him up, we were concerned. He got the base commander and I and said, "We need to talk quickly." He took us into the cloakroom. He said, "It's back." I said, "What's back?" He said, "The UFO's back." And again, we looked at each other. "Oh, come on." Well, my boss had to make a speech and make some presentations, so guess what? Go investigate and put this thing to bed. All right. So I went to the chief of police who was there, and I said, "Who's your senior NCO on?" And he said, "Bobby Ball." I knew him, very competent person. I said, "Have him collect me at the house. I'll go home and change clothes, and we'll go out and take a look and see what this is." I went to Sue Jones, who was the disaster preparedness officer, and said, "Who's your person on standby?" And she said, "Monroe Nevels." I said, "Have Nevels," and I knew Nevels well. He is a photographer as well as a disaster preparedness person. I said, "Have him bring his camera and meet me at the disaster preparedness office." I'm thinking, to put this to rest, I want to take a Geiger counter along to an APN 27. So we all gather together, we go down to the motor pool, get gas, and we go out into the forest. We get out in the forest on the east side of Woodbridge Base, and lo and behold, there's probably 6 or 8 vehicles out there, 2 or 3 light-alls. Light-alls are motor generators with big fluorescent lights on them. They're having trouble making things work. They're having a lot of difficulty. And I'm thinking, all these people out in the forest, this time of night off the base, this is a public relations disaster just waiting to happen. I'm really nervous about this. I'd forgotten almost about the UFO. But they said, look over in there. There's a light glow when you look through the starlight scope. That's a first generation night vision device. And there was. And they said, there's a landing site over there with indentations. So they took me over into the forest, and we find these 3 indentations equal distance apart. You get the Geiger counter out, and lo and behold, there's radiation readings about 8 to 10 times normal background radiation. An extremely higher reading in the center of the triangle formed by the 3 objects. When they put the meter up to the tree, the side facing the landing site was much higher than the back side. We looked up over through the tree canopy. Now these are large Corsica pines, probably 50 to 100 feet tall. And you could see the break and opening in the canopy of the trees and branches on the ground. Well, this is getting a bit bizarre, and I'm starting to think, I wish I hadn't come out here. Right about that time, one of us, and I can't remember who it was, said, look over there, there's a bright red object. And the best way I can describe it, it looks sort of like a football or an eye. It was glowing, orangish red like a fire. It was shedding something like molten metal dripping off it. In the center of it was sort of like wink, like blink. The object was in the forest. It moved horizontally through the trees, bobbing up and down, missing the trees, so it's obviously under some type of intelligent control. Came toward us at one point, then it receded. Beyond the forest, there was a farmer's field and a farmer's house. It went out into the field, so we moved up to the edge of the forest, right along the fence line, watched it for probably 2, 3, 4 minutes, and I noticed the farmer's house directly across from us. The windows were reflecting the glow off this object, and it looked like the house was on fire. It was reflecting so brightly. Off to the right, about 30 degrees, was the lighthouse I keep hearing about for years. The lighthouse cast a white beam. So, these people that talk about the lighthouse, I don't think anybody's ever seen a lighthouse that moved through the forest. By the way, the object then exploded silently into 5 white objects and disappeared. We went out into the field looking for evidence, because I thought if whatever's dripping off this had to burn the ground or leave some evidence behind. We found nothing but, evidence that there were cattle there. Went across the field a little bit, and one of the party, I think it was Bobby Ball, said, look up to the sky up there. We looked up, and there were 3 objects up in the sky to our left, and they were elliptical with multicolored lights on them. They were moving at high speed and making very, very sharp angular turns. The best way I could equate it is they were doing something like a grid search or some type of a flight pattern. We looked to the south, and we saw 2 objects glowing in the sky, white. One of the objects approached overhead very rapidly, stopped overhead, and sent I would say the equivalent of a laser beam, about that big, a steady beam right down to our feet. I'm really freaking out about this time, thinking, is this a signal? Is this possibly a communication, a warning? Are we in trouble? And just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared. The whole time I've been talking into my little pocket recorder, which I carried everywhere I went, so there's a recording out there, and you probably heard it on the internet somewhere, heard about it. I'm also talking on the radio to the command post, asking them, have radar look here, have them look there, what do they see? And I keep getting, they don't see anything, they don't see anything. Well, guess what? Several years later, a friend of mine, Robert Hastings, dug out and identified who the air traffic controllers were in the tower at Bentwaters that night. And he has signed sworn statements from them that they saw the object, physically saw it, watched it on their scope, go across the scope at high speed, come back across, go into the forest where we were. He also dug out the people that were on duty in the weapons storage area, and there's a control tower out there, and they actually saw it go into the forest too. He found a comm man who had been working up there who was frightened to death. He saw it. There are multiple witnesses. As time goes on, more and more people have come forward that were afraid to talk at that time. It's almost shocking. I keep hearing from people that there is no such thing as a cover-up on UFOs. Well, let me tell you something. There is something. I can cite you a couple very good examples. One particular one, a good friend of mine, John Callahan, back in the mid-'80s. Has that got rid of it now? back in the mid-'80s, John Callahan ran the accident investigation section for the FAA in Washington. A JAL airliner, a freighter, was coming in through Alaska when they had a 30-minute or more experience. They were chased, they were harangued, the object went in front of them and went behind them. They got it all on radar, they had the audio tapes, they had everything. It was all bundled up and sent to Washington, and John was responsible for investigating it. He was told to put together a briefing. John put together a briefing. He said, there's some visitors coming to attend, as well as the director of the FAA, or the administrator of the FAA. Two gentlemen came in and listened to the briefing. They got up at the end and introduced themselves, and they said, we're from the CIA. We'll take all that material. This never happened. Something similar happened back in 1964 out of Vandenberg Air Force Base on one of the missile flights. A dummy missile was sent over the Pacific, and very high resolution photography was taken. About 2/3 of the way through the flight path, the object dropped into the sea mysteriously. When they got back and reviewed the films, they saw the two objects came alongside the warhead, flew alongside it, and little beams came out, and the warhead tumbled into the sea. Those are just a couple examples. Since I've gone public, I've probably had 100 people come to me and say, when I was in the military as a pilot, or when I was working here, or I was in a missile silo, here's what happened. And we were told, don't talk about it. This didn't happen. I even talked to police that emptied M16s at objects in the sky over missile sites. There's something out there. Now, I've heard many people say, it's time that the government appoint an agency to investigate this. Folks, there's an agency, very close held, compartmentalized agency that's been investigating this for years. They get their sources from NSA, DIA, CIA, Air Force Intelligence, Army Intelligence, FBI, you name it. You hear about reports getting released. Have you ever heard the results of any of the investigations? In the last couple years, the British have released a ton of information, more than anybody can probably digest. But has anybody ever seen what their conclusions were? Has anybody ever heard anything about vent waters officially? When the documents were released, and Nick can allude to this, the time frame when I was involved in the incident, there's missing. It's gone missing. Nothing else is missing, but the 1980s is missing. Very interesting. I could go on and on and on with a whole lot of examples, but I just wanted to give you my thoughts. They are, number one, there is an agency. It's very compartmentalized, that is collecting, it is doing investigations, and does know a lot more than the general public does, definitely. And there's a very active role played by many of our intelligence agencies that probably don't even know the details of what happens once they collect the data and forward it. Kind of scary, isn't it? So, what can I say? I've never been harassed, probably a couple good reasons. Number one, my rank and some of the jobs I've held, but also early on, I sat down and made a very detailed tape, made several copies of everything I know about it, and they're secluded away. Just an insurance policy. Maybe I'm paranoid, I don't know, but I think it was time well spent when I made the tapes. So give it some thought. Take away two things. There is an agency, I'm firmly convinced, and there is an effort to suppress, or in often cases, such as in the Bentwaters case, I'm convinced the three participants had their minds messed with something terrible. Maybe partly by whatever they encountered in the forest, or what happened in their debriefing, in their hypnosis session. I knew the three people pretty well, one of them especially well, because I'd worked for days and days in the command post during exercises with them. None of them have been the same since. None of them. Kind of scary. I'll leave you with that.
That looks like an absolutely great segue into Nick Pope.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. I would like to thank Alan and all the museum staff for having put on this event, which I think takes not only great organizational skill, but great courage, given the reputation that this subject has. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists. I'm the only civilian here, and I know that all of them have given distinguished government service for their country, including combat tours. So thanks, guys. Um, My own background, as Alan alluded to in his intro, is I'm a civilian. I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, which is the equivalent of your Department of Defence. Between 1991 and 1994, I ran the MOD's UFO project. Just backtracking a little, I just want to say a little bit about, I think, what this event isn't, because I've seen an awful lot of chatter on the internet about this, and myself and some or all of my fellow panelists are sometimes accused of still being on the government payroll. There are lots of rumors about what was going to happen here this evening. Some people were saying this is disinformation, these people, you know, still work for the government. Others were saying this is part of disclosure with a capital D. They're going to tell us it's all spaceships and aliens, and there's a crashed saucer in an Air Force hangar somewhere, and here it all is. You know, if there is that, I'm afraid they didn't tell me about it. So this is not going to be disclosure, neither is this going to be disinformation. What this is going to be, and I mean no disrespect, but let's be honest about this. The UFO subject is a field which does have its fair share of crackpots and charlatans and cultists and things. What you have this evening in a field like that is a panel of people who indisputably and genuinely have done this for the government and the military. This, you know, this was these people's jobs, not their hobby. And while I apologize for those people who might be expecting or hoping for a spaceship in a hangar smoking gun, what you will get this evening and are getting is the real deal, an insight from people who have looked at this mysterious and infuriating subject for the government. And again, for those people who think and say, and again, I've seen a lot of chatter out there in the blogosphere, oh, you know, why is the National Atomic Testing Museum putting on this event? Why is a Smithsonian-affiliated institution dabbling with the subject of UFOs? The museum not only has great courage in doing this, but is in very good company. In 2010, I attended 2 discussion meetings put on by the Royal Society, the Royal Society, arguably one of the world's most prestigious scientific institutions, celebrated its 350th anniversary fairly recently. Previous fellows included Sir Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, more recently Stephen Hawking. And the Royal Society put on 2 discussion meetings, the first of which was entitled The Detection of Extraterrestrial Life and the Consequences for Science and Society. The second follow-up meeting was entitled Towards a Societal Agenda on Extraterrestrial Life. This was multidisciplinary gathering of eminent scientists looking at everything from the kind of effect that this might have on religion through to the more psychological, societal impact. And when I was sitting there hearing phrases like civilizations might migrate to the vicinity of a black hole to tap the energy for their increased needs, and when I sat and listened to phrases such as we may live in a post-biological universe populated by immortal thinking machines, I had to remind myself that I was at the Royal Society and not at a sci-fi convention. But believe you me, there are many, many people in the world of science who do think that these are issues worth contemplating. A little bit of history. The British government's involvement with the UFO phenomenon dates back really to the Second World War, when some of our Bomber Command pilots saw not just balls of light, but structured metallic craft performing speeds and maneuvers that they certainly couldn't match. These became known as Foo Fighters, not to be confused with the band of the same name. But that's why they called themselves that. The British government, interestingly, it was the Ministry of Defence's chief scientific advisor, Sir Henry Tizard, the great radar pioneer, who actually was instrumental in setting up the UK's UFO project, because he said in 1950 that reports of this phenomenon ought not be dismissed without some form of proper scientific investigation taking place. So the Ministry of Defence did what civil servants and government officials do best all around the world. They set up a committee. And this was, to this day, I believe, the most splendidly named committee in the history of government. It was called the Flying Saucer Working Party. And they set up in 1950, reported in 1951. Their conclusion was, UFOs are just misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions. We should spend no more time and effort on this subject. Unfortunately for them, in 1952, there was a wave of sightings throughout the UK where most of the witnesses were Royal Air Force pilots, some of whom chased these things, Royal Air Force radar operatives, many of whom tracked these things. So the Ministry of Defence was dragged somewhat reluctantly back into the subject. From then until the UFO project was axed, sadly, in 2009, victim of defence cuts, we looked at about 12,000 UFO reports over the years. The raison d'etre for looking at these was quite simple. The brief was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon to see whether any sightings gave rise to evidence of any threat or potential threat to the United Kingdom, or anything of more general defense or scientific interest. That was why we looked at UFOs. The methodology, I'm afraid, apologies to Bill and to Bob, we pretty much stole the Blue Book manual on this. We stole your report forms and changed the spelling. We Brits spell defence with a C, not an S. And we stole the investigative methodology too. Interview the witness, check the radar tapes. If you're lucky enough to have a photo or a video, investigate that. What did we find? At the end of all this, we found that about 80% of UFO sightings could be explained as misidentifications of ordinary objects and phenomena, aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors, etc. Not that many people, a lot of people talk about hoaxes, not that many people hoaxed the Ministry of Defence. I think they were afraid we would, as the expression went, send the boys round, wasting our time, which we probably would have. 80% misidentifications, 15% insufficient data, 5% unknown. Does 5% mean alien spacecraft? No, it does not. When people say UFOs, the phrase, do you believe in UFOs, is meaningless. UFOs exist. It's simply people, it's something in the sky you can't identify. Unfortunately, we have fallen victim to the pop culture interpretation of the phrase UFO as alien spacecraft, and that causes a lot of problems. We tried to deal with that in the Ministry of Defence by changing the words, and you'll sometimes see in British government documents phrases like UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, or more recently, unconventional aircraft and unusual helicopter. Pilots don't want to lose their jobs, so when they report something like to their airline, they'll say, I've seen an unusual aircraft, and we'll investigate. So 5% unknown does not mean alien spacecraft. Neither does it mean any of us ruled that out. Unknown simply means unknown. We have some pretty amazing cases. Charles Holt mentioned Rendlesham Forest, of course, probably the most intriguing and compelling case to have taken place on British soil. I had one on my tour of duty called the Cosford incident, very briefly over a period of 6 hours in 30th and 31st March 1993. We had a wave of sightings throughout the UK, dozens of witnesses, lots of police and military, patrol of Air Force police officers at the military base in Cosford saw a UFO go directly over their heads. The meteorological officer at RAF Shawbury saw a huge triangular craft move slowly over his head at a height of about 200 feet. Low frequency humming sound, which he said he could feel as well as hear. Pencil thin beam of light shining down at the ground, tracking backwards and forwards as if it was looking for something. This craft moved at a speed of about 40 or 50 miles an hour, very slowly over the base, then accelerated away to the horizon, as he put it, many times faster than a military jet. When I spoke to him the morning after the sighting, his voice was still shaking, and he said he'd never seen anything like it in his Air Force career. We did a full investigation, of course, came up complete blank. We decided to ask the Americans through the embassy, is it possible that you are operating some sort of secret prototype aircraft or drone and that you inadvertently forgot to ask our permission while testing it over the UK? US government said no. What they said then was very interesting. They took the opportunity to ask us, by the way, do you Brits have in the Royal Air Force some sort of large triangular or delta-shaped craft capable of high Mach speeds and moving from absolute hover to high Mach in a matter of seconds? And if you do, have you inadvertently been testing that over the US and forgetting to ask our permission? Well, because we've been having a few sightings like that. Isn't that interesting? Not least because officially Project Blue Book's been closed down, hasn't it? The US government's no longer in the UFO game, isn't it? Is it? I don't know. We were being asked this question in 1993. A particular concern of ours was near misses between UFOs and commercial aircraft, and our Civil Aviation Authority, which is the equivalent of your FAA, has a lot of those cases, some of which are now being declassified and released under the Freedom of Information Act. One case involving a Boeing 737 on approach to Manchester Airport. The pilot and co-pilot barely had time to flinch. And this huge delta-shaped craft passed rapidly down one side of the aircraft. The co-pilot who had control said his instinct would have been to take violent evasive action, which could have brought down the plane itself. The only thing that stopped him from doing that was the UFO was gone before he could react. Pilots have pretty good quick reactions, so that tells you how fast it was. Another pilot over Kent, another near miss, thought that collision was imminent. He just shouted to his crew, look out, look out. And again, this UFO passed very rapidly down. Those were the cases, the sorts of cases that gave us pause for thought. Is there a cover-up in the UK? I don't know. I've seen no direct evidence of that. But we did certainly, and it was always our policy, to downplay this subject. Colonel Holt mentioned, and this speaks to the cover-up issue, the fact that the British government is in the process of declassifying and releasing its entire archive of UFO files. Tens of thousands of pages. I've been involved in this program personally in view of my work on this project. A small number of files from the Defense Intelligence staff went missing, and it just so happened, sorry Chuck, that this covered the period of the Rendlesham Forest incident. The files from before had survived, the ones from just after had survived. Those files were, quote, inadvertently destroyed, unquote. Sorry, it wasn't me. But we consistently downplayed the subject, and I mentioned the chatter in the blogosphere about, oh, Smithsonian-affiliated institutions shouldn't be putting on subjects like this. We fueled the media's view of this by deliberately using phrases that we fed to the press office when the journalists got in touch with us. We deliberately used phrases like little green men and UFO spotters, and I don't know if that has the same connotations here as it does in the UK, but it conjures up a very nerdish kind of attitude to this. So we deliberately used a combination of spin and dirty tricks to downplay and ridicule this subject. And we also did keep fairly close tabs on the UFO community. We anonymously subscribed to their magazines. What is the bottom line here? I think the bottom line is this. We were interested in UFOs for a number of reasons. Number one, were they secret prototype aircraft and drones belonging to another country, probing our air defenses, as certain nations do, to see how effective we are in both detection and interdiction? If these things are foreign military aircraft and drones, of course we want to know about them. If they are our own secret prototype aircraft and drones, we want to know how widely these things are known about. And my goodness, if somebody sees one and reports it, let alone gets a photo, we would far rather that was reported as a UFO than as, hey, we've just seen the Royal Air Force's latest aircraft and it's really good. Google something like BAE, that's British Aerospace, BAE Industries Taranis, the god of war. That's our next generation, what are we supposed to call them now? Not an unmanned aerial vehicle, remotely piloted vehicle. It's our next generation one. You look at that, you look at the promotional pictures, it looks like a spaceship in a hangar. BAE Taranis. If something like that, which you can guarantee flies long before it's publicly declared, is seen, we would far rather it's reported as a flying saucer and the story is dismissed and or laughed at. What if UFOs are something more exotic? The MOD did a study a few years ago called Project Condign, classified secret UKIA, speculated that UFOs might be attributable, some of them, to exotic atmospheric plasmas. What was our view? Well, if that's true, we want to be able to, and sorry, this is not very politically correct or new age, but we wanted to know, could we weaponize it? And if UFOs did turn out to be something else, and you know, we never said never. Well, you know, never rule anything out, and as long as the probability is as long as it's a non-zero probability, we were prepared to think the unthinkable. After all, extraterrestrial visitation might be the ultimate low probability, high impact event. But if it did turn out to be this, obviously the Ministry of Defence's interests would be technology acquisition. What can these things teach us about aerodynamics, propulsion systems? And can we get this exclusively to the UK military-industrial complex? You know, which is a very good, probably the only good reason for UFO secrecy. And in all of this, and I'll conclude with this remark, in all of this, we were mindful of one thing. But one more memo to read you. This is a direct quote from a Defense Intelligence staff memo on this, which gives you an insight into the MOD mindset. I'll read this if you don't mind, but this is out there on the net. If the sightings are of devices not of the Earth, their purpose needs to be established as a matter of priority. There has been no apparent hostile intent, and other possibilities are A, military reconnaissance, B, scientific study, C, tourism. That is an official Defense Intelligence Staff memo, now declassified and released. But finally, in concluding, I would say this. Always in our minds was this one thing. Whatever the nonsense you see about this subject sometimes in the field, we never lost sight of the fact that in all these hundreds of thousands of sightings, the believers only had to be right once, and everything changes. Thank you very much.
Nick, that's a rather marvelous analysis of that. And to kind of tie some things together here, we have Colonel John Alexander.
Let me start. I did an hour-and-a-half presentation in May. How many people were here for that? Oh, not that many. Okay, good enough. The first line of my book, where I want to start in the life years, is, like Colonel Friend said, UFOs are real. And I mean that in the most prosaic sense. Physical, craft, and basically every sensor system we have picks them up. Since I'm following Nick Pope, I'd like to tell a story about him. And I'm going to want him to fill in the blank, because people don't realize really how well connected. And it was interesting because until I published this, nobody had connected the dots. I'll get to I had run a group for a long time. As they mentioned, I was working in non-lethal weapons. And I got a call from CIA that said Ron Oxborough, who is the chief scientific advisor for MOD in the UK, is coming to visit and he wants to talk to you. That's all the information. So I looked up his background and all that. Said, well, obviously he's going to want to discuss non-lethal weapons. So he came in, he had an entourage with him, and everybody else left. And we were one-on-one, and we had a 2-hour discussion about non-lethal weapons that went, pretty nicely. And then they left, and then a few days later, I get a call from the agency. He says, boy, you really blew that. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, he wanted to talk about UFOs. And I said, well, there are only 2 of us in the room, we're behind the fence. He could have brought it up, and he chose not to. So a couple of years later, he had then retired and become Lord Oxborough. And I was working a NATO study and was in London. And he was over there as the head of Imperial College, a very well-known engineering school. So I went up and I said, I understand you want to talk about this other topic. And we discussed about these. I said, well, why don't you ask Nick Pope about it? Because he's the guy who's been working the desk down at, and we had met at Whitehall before this, and he's the one who should have all the information about what's going on in the UK. And he says, Nicky? Why, his father was my deputy. And it turns out that Nick's father was a renowned scientist. He had headed Farnborough, if you know what that is. I mean, that was the premier base of UK aerospace, and he now was the government servant who was the civilian in charge or working for Sir Ron Oxborough. And so I had a discussion with Nick sometime later. I said, hey, I understand who your father is. By the way, he has many American accolades and all that. And so he said to Nick, if we had a UFO...
It would be in my hangar.
Yeah, he said, if we had a UFO, it would have been in his hangar. So Nick was not only doing these things at a level for the MOD per se, but it has a family relationship that goes back for quite a ways. I think there is a very fundamental problem to begin with, and that is, what are we talking about? He says, what is the definition of a UFO? And the problem here is I got little balls of light that fly around. I got gigantic craft, more than a mile across, that do show up on sensor systems and are seen, and everything in between. And from my perspective, it's that everything in between that's really kind of a problem, because we keep saying, what do they want, where are they from, as if they're one simple single answer. And from my perspective, there's not going to be one answer that resolves this. I think the phenomena are terribly complex. Now, you might suggest, if it is ET coming here or something like that, and we'll take the visit, is it a visit or a tourism thing? Earth must be on the bucket list for some place out there in the universe that keeps sending all these kinds of folks here. Because not only do we have problems, no, we've had reports of contact between humans and sentient non-human beings throughout human history. And adding UFOs to that is really a relatively new wrinkle. Now also belief systems get to be problematic, because we have from debunkers and skeptics. Unfortunately, most of the people who claim to be skeptics are actually debunkers. They wouldn't believe it no matter how much evidence you piled in front of them. Then we have to people who believe that UFOs exist. And then we have crashes and retrieval. One of the things I talk about in the book, I list all of the crashes that have been reported out here. And I said, if even half of these are right, ET has a quality control problem. They can come a gazillion miles here and they keep falling down. And then you get to ARV, or the alien re-engineered vehicle, and there are those who propose that we actually have had, we had a crash, probably Roswell, we've been reverse engineering it and flying around. For that, I have the $10 trillion challenge out that says, if so, it's not about a little widget flying around, which would be kind of neat. It's about understanding a fundamental different kind of energy. And energy is the long pole in the tent. And if we had that, we'd been doing something other than just, whipping around, scaring people. And finally, you get to aliens walking among us. Now, interestingly, there was a very recent poll, and it said, not just the United States, no, this was a global poll, said 20% of the people believe that aliens are here and walking among us. Now, it turns out that while I was on active duty, I was able to put together a group. We called it the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group, and we did that. This was time when FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, was out there, and I wanted to put out, use words that you would probably not guess. I mean, there were lots of, in fact, the people who put out FOIA, what they never anticipated, in the early years, 50% of the FOIA requests came in were dealt with UFOs. And that was totally unanticipated by Congress when they wrote that act. So anyway, I put together a group, and I had people from all of the services, the intelligence community, and from aerospace. To participate, you had to have both top secret and SCI clearance. They're known as above top secret. That's not really true. They had to know who you are, and we participated. And what we found is considerably different. And by the way, I should tell you there are differences even with those of us here on the panel. But what we found is basically nobody was minding the store. Of course, one of the cases that came up that I thought was really good, and everybody's found out, is the one that Chuck had with Bentwaters. And particularly what he didn't mention is that, there's 60 to 80 witnesses that were there at least, and never mentioned the PRP, which I think is this is a personnel reliability program. And these weren't your average folks. They had had psychological testing, they had to do P-tests for drugs and all of that. So these were highly qualified people and witnesses who had, now he's talked about the case, but I want to add a couple other things and really take on the press here. And give you an example, because I think the press is certainly complicit in part of the problems that we have. One of them was a guy comes up, they will accept almost any story, even if the facts don't fit, and say, we have solved that. For instance, in Chuck's case at Bentwaters, one of them, a guy had a honey wagon out there and said, oh, I was the lights that they saw, we saw the honey wagon bank. Well, obviously that doesn't fit the facts that he's mentioned. Another one that I thought was even more preposterous and came out about a couple of years ago in December is when, what Jim Peniston described was this cone-shaped vehicle that was out there. He didn't mention that they actually have plaster casts of the indentations that were taken at that side, nor the background radiation readings were above normal. But this explanation was that we had an Apollo capsule, which was a dummy, and somehow they were moving it and flying over and had dropped this Apollo capsule into the Rendlesham Forest. As far as I know, we haven't lost any Apollo capsules or anything. But the point here more was how the press takes these things and takes any preposterous response and, just runs with it. Since we're talking about military, I thought I'd throw in just very, very quickly some of the cases that have come out. One of them, it was a case in Minot, North Dakota, with a B-52. B-52 is flying with Brad Runyon as a pilot, and they're just coming back from a normal mission, and they get hit by the control tower. Says, we want to vector you to a certain place. Well, why? Well, you'll know it if you see it. Long story short is they fly over a UFO. They're flying over, they look down, they see a craft that's several hundred feet long glowing on the ground. Now, in addition to the crew in the air, there are people on the ground. They're the ones who had alerted them. They were driving out at the time and looking over, and so you have that perspective. So you got multiple perspectives of a craft totally unexplained. Now, one of the things they did is something came after the B-52 was caught on radar, and you had Runyon had the foresight of going out and saying, take a picture, so you actually have a picture of the radar scope with something approaching it. Can't explain it. There was the Larry Coyne case, which was listed as one of the best ones. This is a helicopter case. They're flying a Huey. This is a reserve unit. They had gone off to have some medical tests done, and they were flying back late at night, and as they're coming along, says, off to the right, they see, here's a red light, and it's coming right at them, and they don't know what it is. So he thinks they have to go into collision avoidance, pushes the collective all the way down, which means, by the way, the helicopter ought to be dropping at 3,000 feet a minute. And all of a sudden, green light takes them over, and they're being pulled up, even though the collective is all the way down. Now, the explanation was they got scared and didn't know which way they had, the pilot knew how to fly it or anything. What later came out, though, was here again, we had independent ground witnesses who had seen the incident as well. Interestingly, when the helicopter went back, it became what was known as a hangar queen, meaning it never flew quite right again, and they couldn't quite figure out why that was true. There was a guy, I hope that when I wrote the book, there's a local man, Larry Jividan, contacted me, and this was a case that was totally unknown before. He was a commercial airline pilot who had had a remarkable experience, but he had had this experience when he was a Marine in the Marine Reserve and was flying near Pensacola. And this is a case where they're flying along at night. Multiple witness cases because they have 6, counting him, naval flight officers on board on the test, and all of a sudden this thing is again off and moves across them, contacted all the various radars in the Pensacola area. Nobody's got it out there, stayed with them for about 5 minutes, and then again went shooting off. Usually when I do this, I can show satellites. Yes, satellites do pick them up. We did want to address this issue of his ET here, and Steve Bassett was going to be here. Unfortunately, he didn't make it because this is one of his raison d'etres. But my argument is, if ET is here, it's certainly not here for our benefit. If you look at what's going on with, wars and poverty and all of the issues that are going on in the world, if he's here, they rode in with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, we've heard, and in fact, Colonel Friend mentioned, what agency is going to involve in this, and my guess is none. And Chuck and I were going to have a discussion when we finish here. I'll tell them what happened with Callahan's files, very prosaic answer. But there's a number that I use in basically every briefing I give. And this is, 16 trillion, 52 100 billion, 390, 16 trillion, 52 billion, 390 million, 738,831 and 73 cents. Sometime today, that was our national debt. And I say sometime because those lower numbers are spinning so fast you couldn't even read them as they're going out there. And the point is, given the wars that have gone on, and particularly what's still going on in Afghanistan, one of the things I point out, I usually have a slide that shows a sergeant coming home to Arlington Cemetery after his 14th combat tour, meaning we now have men and women who have been in combat twice as long as anybody in World War II. And you throw that up with what we know here in Las Vegas on the housing problem, health problems, and all of that. When you do rack and stack, meaning how you're going to use your budget, it's just highly unlikely that we are going to have any agencies involved, and if they did, they'd be risking their budget. Another problem we have is in studying UFOs is this perception, because up here, what we talked about is case after case after case, and you put that up and it looks like a pretty good pile. When you amortize that over at least half a century and a world, they're really pretty well, pretty rare events. I actually did some numbers on this because I talked to Dick Haynes, who he does the studies on the pilot cases. And what he told me is they get about 7 pilot cases per year. They've got about 3,000 on hand, but they also say most of those were not when they were flying. And I'm guessing maybe 1% are actually reported, because we do know it's not career enhancing to report UFOs, and people are not going to come forward and do that. But what I did is I took that number and said, okay, well, let's look, and for last year, is that if that's 1%, then that gives us 700 cases. But when you amortize that just in the U.S. alone against 17.5 billion flying hours, your probability of seeing something is 0.00004%, meaning these are really, really rare events. And unfortunately, we don't look at it that way. They tend to look at, boy, is this a big sack of things. There also have been some key cases with armed interactions. Those sorts of things have happened, not so much for the U.S. There was a case of Milton Torres, and this is one that Nick ran into. This is a kind of a classic example. The first time we ever heard of this guy was when the UK released their reports. But let's see, it's May of '57. He's flying out of Lakenheath, and he gets vectored out to go see something. He says, what is it? Trust me, you'll know it if you see it. And what he reported seeing is something the size of an aircraft carrier flying over the UK. That was kind of interesting. So they directed him to shoot at it, basically to ripple his rockets. And when they did, as it said, this thing went zip and was gone. They said in 2 swipes of the radar, 2 circles of the radar, it was off the screen, meaning it went from near zero to covering 250 miles in 2 seconds. Now here's one where secrecy did hurt. Came back, said sit down, shut up, you'll never talk about this again. They threatened his wings. For young pilots, that's the kiss of death, right? You'd say, I'm going to take your wings away. You're not going to do that. So he was quiet, and the next time we heard was the UK is releasing this report of it's coming out. Nick was kind enough to call him and said, oh, by the way, in 24 hours you're going to be famous. And he had no idea about it. One of the issues I've noticed here is the impact of secrecy, because I've watched him talk, and Nick knows him better than I do. Every time he discussed this, he would just break into tears. I mean, the emotional strain of not talking. And said one of his biggest regrets was never telling his father, who had died a short time before that of what he had seen, because he thought the thing was that impactful. Of course, there's the famous case in Iran where you have fighters that are sent up to intercept an object. What's interesting there, and this was interesting from my perspective, I might mention my last job was Director of Advanced Systems Concepts at Army Laboratory Command. I had all of the tactical directed energy in the Army, so I knew a fair amount about how energy systems work. And this is one where, again, the pilots went in, you had ground observation, you did have radar contact seen from many different angles, and so the pilot, as he flies in, has his communications panel shut off. Another one went in, and he was told to go ahead and shoot. He says when he did, all the electronics are shut down. He turns and banks and comes out, and the electronics come back and they fly off. Now, my point about telling about directed energy, I know how to turn you off. What I don't know how to do is to, turn you off and turn you back on again like that, which is exactly what happened in that case. There was another one with the Huertas in Peru, where he actually was engaged and fired on a UFO, and it said it kind of went, and just sucked the bullets and played with him for a long time and didn't bother him. I'd conclude by saying, A, it's real. B, it's a global phenomenon. This is not something that just happens here in the U.S. And that I think the problem in research today is just overtaken by today's events. I also suggest that there's no simple answers. I will argue that not only do we not have the answers, we're not at the point of asking the right questions yet. And that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Alexander, and also to our esteemed panel. Well, as you can see, I think we've laid the basis for a couple of really good questions that I hope will come out of the audience here. And we're going to do that. But let me kind of set just a little bit of a set of ground rules here, okay? We got a lot of people here. I know probably a lot of people want to ask questions. If you do, it may be a little difficult to hear. We'll try and get a microphone if we can down in front. So if you'd like to ask a question and you think you're way in the back, you might want to filter up this way. We'll do this by taking some short questions. I hope you keep it to 1 or 2 sentences. If you start into a long discussion, don't feel bad if I cut you off. And if you don't stop then, men in black on the outside will come get you. Okay, so we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Why do you think that they're holding back all this so nobody will actually identify that we have a UFO? Why don't they release some of this information? Why don't they release it?
The question is, why are they holding back and why don't they release information on
I
UFOs?
personally think they're preparing us for some point in the future. In other words, gradually releasing things, be more relaxed. For instance, what the UK did, letting all the reports come out, kind of condition us to be ready to accept whatever they know.